Everyone thinks the magic of a 1960s tuna casserole was Campbell's cream of mushroom. They're wrong. The real secret, the ingredient that made it unforgettable, sat in a flimsy waxed paper bag on top of the refrigerator, quietly waiting for its moment of transformation. It wasn't the tuna. It wasn't the noodles. It wasn't even the soup. It was something crushed, salted, and sprinkled on at the last possible moment before the oven door swung shut. And once you understand what it was and why it worked, you will never look at a Pyrex dish the same way again. Pull up a chair, pour yourself something cold. Because tonight we are going on a little detective mission back to the kitchens of Eisenhower's America, through the early Kennedy years, and straight into the beating heart of the mid-60s suburban supper table. We are looking for a single ingredient, a humble one, an ingredient so ordinary that nobody in 1965 thought to write it down in the family recipe box, because everybody already knew. It was the understood thing, the silent punctuation at the end of a sentence everyone could already read, and yet, somehow, in the decades since, we forgot. We let the secret slip. The casseroles of the 21st century so often miss the mark by a single crucial step. Something golden, something shattering, something that crackles under a fork before giving way to the soft, creamy yield below. That something, friends, was a handful of crushed potato chips, not breadcrumbs, not buttered cracker crumbs, not a ladylike dusting of paprika or parsley. Potato chips, Lay's most often. Sometimes the ridged ruffles that came along a bit later, crushed right there in the bag with the flat of your palm until the shards caught the kitchen light like broken glass from a stained glass window, then scattered, generous and golden, across the top of the bubbling cream and tuna and noodle beneath, and slid into a 350-degree oven for those last 10 transformative minutes. To understand how this ingredient ended up there and why it became so universal by the middle of the 1960s that nobody thought to question it, we have to go back, not to the casserole, to the chip. The potato chip, as Americans knew it in 1965, was essentially the work of one man, a soft-spoken Southerner named Herman Lay. Herman Lay was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he had the kind of traveling salesman hustle that ran like a vein of copper through a certain generation of American entrepreneurs. In 1932, in the teeth of the Depression, he started selling potato chips out of the trunk of his Model A Ford across the Nashville territory, working routes that had been dropped by a struggling Atlanta chip maker called the Barrett Food Company. He sold chips to gas stations, to drugstores, to the little country markets tucked into the corners of courthouse squares all across Tennessee and Georgia and the Carolinas. In 1938, when Barrett Food went under, Herman Lay bought the company outright and rechristened it the H.W. Lay Lingo Company. The name was eventually simplified. You have heard of it, Lay's. Now listen to this, because it matters. Before Herman Lay, potato chips were a regional novelty. They were a snack you found at a lunch counter next to your egg salad sandwich, or scooped out of a barrel at a general store, often stale, often soft, rarely consistent. Herman Lay industrialized them. He built plants. He standardized the fry. He put them in branded packaging that traveled. And he pushed them hard into the South, into territories that had never thought of a potato chip as a pantry staple, and by the late 1940s, thanks to him, potato chips were no longer a regional curiosity. They were an American given. Stop for a moment and picture that pantry. A 1950s kitchen cabinet, painted pale yellow, a little sticky near the handle, a can of Campbell's soup, a box of Kraft macaroni, a tin of bumblebee tuna, and perched on top of the refrigerator because the bag was too big to fit inside the cabinet, a cellophane sack of Lay's potato chips. This was the American pantry by the middle of the century. These were the tools. And when a generation of home cooks sat down to solve a problem, these were the materials they had. The problem, though. Let's talk about the problem, because every great invention begins with one. The problem was that tuna casserole, in its original form, was boring. And worse than boring, it was soft. Go back to the earliest printed tuna noodle casserole recipes, which start showing up in American community cookbooks in the 1930s and really proliferate in the early 1940s. And you will find a dish that is essentially a sad, uniform beige. Canned tuna, drained. Egg noodles, boiled. A white sauce or a can of condensed cream soup, whichever was at hand. Some peas if you were feeling generous. All of it stirred together and baked in a casserole dish until the top developed a thin skin and the edges bubbled up faintly brown. That was dinner. That was Thursday. And the problem, the real problem, was texture. You put a fork into that dish and it went straight through. No resistance, no contrast. Noodles soft, tuna soft, sauce soft. Peas, somehow, softer than any vegetable has a right to be. It was a dish with no percussion, no rhythm. It was a lullaby when what a family supper needed, at the end of a long suburban workday, was a little beat, a little punch, a little wake-up. Something to remind the mouth that it was still eating, still engaged, still alive. Home cooks knew this. They felt it, even if they could not have named it. And so, beginning in the late 1940s and accelerating, through the 50s, they went looking for a topping. Something to go on top of the casserole. Something that would bring back the bite. Here is where the detective work gets interesting, because the first attempts, the ones that show up in women's magazines and junior league cookbooks of the Truman and early Eisenhower years, were not potato chips. They were breadcrumbs. Let me pause here and say something about breadcrumbs, because we need to be fair to them. Breadcrumbs, properly handled, toasted in butter and seasoned with a little salt and maybe a whisper of parsley, are a beautiful thing on top of a gratin or a stuffed tomato. In the hands of a French cook, they sing. But on a tuna noodle casserole, in the hands of a 1952 housewife working with 3 children hanging off her apron and a pot roast in the other oven, and a husband due home in 15 minutes, the breadcrumb topping had a fatal flaw. It got soggy. Oh, did it ever get soggy? The steam coming up off the bubbling cream sauce would rise through the crumbs and turn them into wet little pellets, indistinguishable in texture from the noodles beneath. You ended up with a dish that was supposed to have a crispy top and instead had a top that was merely a slightly different flavor of wet. The crumbs surrendered. They gave up. They joined the soft. So the cooks pivoted. Cornflakes. That was the next attempt. Kellogg's cornflakes, crushed up by hand, sprinkled across the top before baking. And at first glance, this seemed like the answer. Cornflakes had crunch. Cornflakes had color. Cornflakes held their shape better than breadcrumbs. There was a brief, bright moment in the early 50s when cornflake-topped casseroles seemed poised to take over. Recipes from 1953 and 1954 in Better Homes and Gardens, in Good Housekeeping, in the Betty Crocker test kitchen pamphlets, called confidently for a cornflake topping. But the cornflake had its own fatal flaw. And if you have ever tasted a cornflake on top of a savory dish, you already know what it is. Cornflakes are sweet, not sweet like candy. but sweet in that subtle, malted, toasted grain way. That works beautifully next to a bowl of milk and a sliced banana at 8 in the morning, and works terribly next to a forkful of canned tuna and cream sauce at 6 in the evening. The sweetness clashed. It made the whole dish taste confused, like it could not decide whether it was a main course or a strange, warm breakfast. Home cooks tried. Some added extra salt. Some mixed in grated cheese. But the underlying sweetness was structural. It was baked, if you will forgive the word, into the flake itself, and you could not get it out. Take a breath with me here, because this is the pivot point. This is where the story turns. We have a problem, which is the softness of the casserole. We have a failed solution, which is breadcrumbs that went soggy. We have a second failed solution, which is cornflakes that went sweet. And somewhere in the middle of the 1950s, in some kitchen whose name we will never know, some home cook reached up to the top of the refrigerator, pulled down that bag of Lay's potato chips and thought, what if? What if? What if the thing that belonged on top of the casserole had been sitting in the pantry all along? The first published record of a crushed potato chip topping on a tuna casserole that food historians have been able to track down with confidence shows up in the middle 1950s, in the pages of magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping. There are earlier candidates, regional cookbooks, and church bulletins that may push the date back a year or two. But by 1955, the instruction to top the casserole with crushed potato chips is appearing in nationally circulated recipes. By 1957, it is common. By 1959, it is standard. And by the time we get into the heart of the 1960s, the crushed potato chip topping has conquered the American tuna casserole so completely that alternatives have essentially vanished from the printed record. Now, why did it work? Because this is the part where the detective puts down the magnifying glass and picks up the notebook. This is the part where we explain the mechanism. It worked for 4 reasons, and all 4 of them were happening simultaneously in that oven in those last 10 minutes of baking. Reason 1. Fat. A potato chip, by weight, is somewhere around 30 to 35% fat. That is cooking oil that has already been heated to a high temperature and absorbed into the structure of the potato itself. When you put a crushed potato chip on top of a casserole and bake it, that fat melts, and it carries flavor, and it bastes the top of the noodles below. And it creates a rich, golden sheen across the surface of the dish that no breadcrumb and no cornflake could ever manage. Breadcrumbs are dry. Cornflakes are dry. A potato chip comes preloaded with its own butter. It is, in a sense, a self-saucing topping. Reason 2. Salt. A good 1960s potato chip was crusted with fine salt, the kind that melted almost instantly in the presence of heat and moisture. When the casserole came out of the oven, that salt had already dissolved into the top layer of cream sauce, seasoning the dish from above in a way that pre-salting the sauce simply could not replicate. It was a salt delivery system. The chip melted its minerals down into the dish during baking, and what remained on top was salt-crusted potato and golden oil and crunch. Reason 3. Crunch. This was the whole reason we started this journey. Remember the problem. The casserole was soft. The casserole had no texture. And here was a topping that, even after 10 minutes in a hot oven, retained its shatter. The fat-to-starch ratio of a potato chip is such that it does not absorb moisture the way a breadcrumb does. It holds its architecture. When your fork came down on that golden top, it did not sink. It met resistance. It broke through with a small, satisfying crack, the kind of sound that makes you want to take a second bite before you have even fully chewed the first. Reason 4. And this is the one that elevates the dish from clever to masterful. Maillard browning. The chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that happens on the surface of food at high temperatures and produces those deep, savory, roasted flavors we associate with crusts and sears and the golden edges of baked bread. A potato chip, because it has already been fried once, is primed for Maillard browning the moment it enters a second heat. Those last 10 minutes in the oven push the chips to a darker, richer gold. The starches caramelize. The oils develop nutty, toasted notes. What comes out of the oven is not merely a chip sitting on top of a casserole. It is a chip that has been reborn, transformed, deepened, and fused with the creamy, bubbling dish beneath into something entirely new. Pause here. Take a sip of whatever you're drinking. Because what those 1950s home cooks stumbled onto, without knowing the chemistry, was a genuine culinary breakthrough. They used what they had. They used the American pantry, and they made something better than the sum of its parts. And as this topping took hold, something was happening in parallel in the American food industry that supercharged its spread. In 1961, Herman Lay's potato chip company merged with the Frito Company of Texas, the maker of corn chips founded by a fellow named C.E. Doolin. The merger created Frito-Lay, a snack food colossus with a national distribution network that the previous generation of potato chip makers could only have dreamed of. Suddenly, a bag of Lays was available not just in the South, where Herman Lay had built his empire, but everywhere, every state, every supermarket, every corner grocery. The bag on top of the refrigerator was no longer a regional totem, it was a national institution. And it was not alone up there. In 1948, a man named Bernhard Stammer had patented a machine that could cut ridges into a potato slice before frying, producing a thicker, wavier, sturdier chip that eventually came to market, under a name that became synonymous with the concept itself, Ruffles. By the early 1960s, Ruffles had been absorbed into the Frito-Lay empire, and suddenly, American home cooks had a choice. You could top your casserole with classic Lays, which gave you a fine, delicate, almost lace-like shatter across the top. Or you could top it with Ruffles, which gave you a heartier, more aggressive crunch, chunks that held up under the fork and delivered a more assertive bite. Neither was wrong. Each had its partisans. Family arguments were had over it. Recipe cards specified one or the other with a seriousness that, looking back now, is genuinely charming. Let me paint you the kitchen. Let me paint you the scene, because this is what we are really talking about. It is a Thursday evening in the fall of 1965, somewhere in the suburbs of Cleveland, or Denver, or Atlanta, or Sacramento. The light through the kitchen window is going that low amber color that American light goes in October. A radio on the counter is playing something low, maybe the news, maybe a little Andy Williams. The mother of the house has already cooked a pound of egg noodles, drained them, and returned them to the pot. She has opened 2 cans of star-kissed tuna, white albacore packed in water, and flaked them with a fork into the noodles. She has opened a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, the red and white can with the gold medallion on the label, and poured it in. She has added a half can of whole milk, cup of frozen peas, a handful of grated sharp cheddar. She has stirred it all together and scraped it into a rectangular Pyrex dish, the kind with the little scalloped handles, and set it on the counter. And now comes the moment. She reaches up. The bag is on top of the refrigerator the way it always is, the way it has been all week. She pulls it down. She opens it. She sticks her hand in, grabs a generous fistful of Lay's and holds it over the casserole. She closes her fist slowly. The chips crumble between her fingers. You can hear it. That sound is the sound of 1965. That papery, crackling collapse as the chips turn to shards. She releases them across the top of the casserole. They fall in a pale golden drift, uneven, overlapping, glinting with salt and oil. She sprinkles a little more cheese across the top. She slides the dish into the oven. The door clicks shut. She sets the timer for 30 minutes. And in those 30 minutes, the kitchen fills with a smell that a generation of Americans will remember for the rest of their lives. The cream sauce bubbles. The tuna gives up its ocean. The noodles soften further into yielding ribbons. But on top, something else is happening. The chips are browning. The oils in them are reheating, loosening, running down in tiny rivulets into the cream below. The salt crystals are melting. The surface is going from pale gold to deep gold to an almost mahogany at the edges, where the casserole meets the Pyrex. The Maillard reaction is in full bloom. The whole top of the dish is developing that glistening brown gold surface that photographers at women's magazines in the mid-60s could not get enough of. Look at any issue of McCall's or Family Circle from 1964 through 1967, and you will see that surface photographed again and again. The golden crunch, the aesthetic of supper. Take a step back for a moment. Let's put this in context. 1965, the year this casserole peaked, was also the year that American per capita tuna consumption hit its historic high water mark. Roughly 5 pounds of tuna per person per year. That is every man, woman, and child in the country, eating nearly 5 pounds of canned fish, most of it going into casseroles, sandwiches, and salads. The tuna industry had become enormous. Star-Kissed, founded in California in the 19-teens, and Chicken of the Sea, founded in San Diego a few years later, were locked in a marketing war that would have made any modern brand consultant proud. Radio jingles, television ads, sponsored cooking segments, free recipe cards at the checkout counter. Each company trying to convince the American housewife that its tuna was the one to reach for. And in 1961, the very year the Frito-Lay merger happened, the Star-Kissed company introduced a cartoon mascot that would become one of the most recognizable advertising characters of the decade, Charlie the Tuna, a hip, bebop-loving, beret-wearing fish who spent every commercial trying desperately to convince the Star-Kissed fishermen that he had good taste, only to be rejected with the now legendary tagline, "Sorry, Charlie, Star-Kissed doesn't want tunas with good taste. Star-Kissed wants tunas that taste good." Charlie was the creation of the Leo Burnett advertising agency in Chicago, and he voiced over by a character actor named Herschel Bernardi. For a generation of American children, Charlie was not just a mascot. He was a member of the family. His face was on the can. The can was in the pantry. The pantry was in the kitchen. And the kitchen, on Thursday night, became a tuna casserole. Pause again. I want you to sit with that for a second. In 1965, 3 different American food empires, Lay's potato chips, Campbell's condensed soups, and Star-Kissed tuna, had converged, almost by accident, on the same cheap, warm, filling, family-pleasing Thursday night supper. None of them planned it. None of them coordinated. But the home cooks of America, working with what was in their pantries, had stitched these 3 empires together into a single casserole dish. And the topping, the crowning glory, the secret ingredient that made the whole thing sing, was Herman Lay's Southern-born, now nationalized potato chip. There is something in that story worth pausing over, because this is really a story about how American food history happens. Not in restaurants, not in culinary schools, but in the quiet, unglamorous kitchens of ordinary people who take the ingredients they have and combine them into something none of the manufacturers ever intended. The potato chip was invented to be eaten out of the bag. Herman Lay did not sit in Nashville in 1938 and dream of a tuna casserole topping. Campbell's did not formulate cream of mushroom soup with a fish dish in mind. Starkist did not pack its tuna with noodles in view. But together, in millions of home kitchens, these products found each other. They became a tradition. And the tradition lasted. Through the 1960s, certainly. Into the 70s. Into the 80s, a little mocked now by food writers who had discovered French cuisine. And now, in our own century, it is experiencing a quiet revival as younger cooks rediscover the humble casserole and the elegant logic of its parts. If you make a tuna casserole tonight, and I hope you will, I want you to honor the secret. Do not skip the chips. Do not substitute panko. Do not substitute crackers. Do not substitute anything modern and fancy and dried. Reach for a real bag of potato chips, Lay's if you can find them, Ruffles if you prefer the heartier crunch. Crush them with your hand, right there over the casserole. Listen to the sound. That sound connects you to a million kitchens, to a million mothers and grandmothers, to a Herman Lay trunk full of chip bags rattling down a Tennessee back road in 1934. Sprinkle them thick. Do not be stingy. A good tuna casserole wants a good golden inch of crushed chip across its top, glistening with fat, seasoned with the salt that will melt down into the cream below. Bake it in a good hot oven, 350 degrees, for 30 to 40 minutes, until the edges bubble and the top goes that deep mahogany gold that the magazine photographers loved so much. Let it rest on the counter for 5 minutes. Then bring it to the table. And when you lower the fork through the top and you feel it hit the chips, and you hear that small, bright shatter, and the fork breaks through into the creamy give of the noodles below, and you lift a bite to your mouth that has salt and fat and crunch and cream and tuna and noodle and pea and cheese, all in a single layered sequence, you will understand something that cannot be put into words. You will understand what 1965 tasted like. You will understand why a generation of Americans remembers Thursday night supper the way they do. You will understand why, for all the ridicule that mid-century cooking has taken, in the decades since, there was real genius in those kitchens. Quiet genius. Unnamed genius. The genius of a home cook who reached up one evening and pulled down a bag of chips and thought, what if? So here is the heritage invitation, the one I want to leave you with. This week, on a Thursday if you can manage it, but any night will do, make a tuna casserole. Buy the noodles, open the cans, stir in the soup, grate the cheese, frozen peas if you like them, into the Pyrex, into the oven, and then, at the last moment, the secret. The real secret. The one your grandmother knew and her mother maybe knew before her. A generous fistful of crushed potato chips scattered in a golden drift across the top, salt and fat and crunch and Maillard waiting to happen. Pull it out of the oven when the top is bronze and bubbling. Set it on a trivet on the kitchen table. Sit down with the people you love. Lower your fork. Listen for the shatter. Take the first bite. Taste what 1965 tasted like. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife salesmen go to, a soft-spoken North Carolina boy named Herman Lay will smile, and Charlie the Tuna will raise his beret. and a whole generation of American home cooks will nod, quietly, from their kitchens across the years, because you finally figured out the secret they knew all along. The bag on top of the refrigerator. That was it. That was always it.